Supply-side policies are actions by policymakers which attempt to shift aggregate supply curve rather than aggregate demand. The main idea is that they try to promote the growth in potential rather than current output and speed up the rate of economic growth. If you recall the lecture on economic growth, we have actually learned that in order to promote economic growth, we need to increase the amount of factors of production in our disposal, amount of labor, capital, land, entrepreneurship, and so on, and or increase their productivity. In other words, the efficiency. Anything which aims to increase the amount of factors of production or their efficiency represent supply-side policies. For example, supply-side policies can include stimulating investment in order to increase capital stock, human capital as well, and increase productivity of both capital and labor. Stimulating technological progress will increase the rate of economic growth and it will increase potential output which our country can produce. Technological progress will shift production possibility frontier, production possibility curve outwards, which means that we are able to produce more of every good in our country, a variety of goods. Apart from this, we can try to stimulate the accumulation of human capital. In other words, we can invest in education and training. In this case, our population, our labor force become more efficient. It acquires additional skills, which means that the potential output which our country can produce is now higher. And if you look at the graph, supply-side policy will look like this. We remain on the same aggregate demand curve. We don't attempt to shift it. We don't want any downsides of the demand-side policy. Instead, we will try to affect the location of aggregate supply curve. Let's imagine that this was our original equilibrium. This was our original level of output, national output, certain original price level 1, and then we somehow shift aggregate supply curve to a new higher level. Our production potential is now higher. Our production possibility frontier, PPF curve, which shows how many different goods we can produce, has now shifted outwards. We are able to produce more, right? What does it mean? This means that our economy moves to a new equilibrium, which implies that now we are able to produce a higher level of output, but most importantly, at a lower price level too. Pay attention. The supply-side policy is great because it not only helps us to achieve higher production level, higher national income, higher employment, lower unemployment level, but also reduces prices and allows us to slow down inflation. It doesn't have the downsides of the demand-side policies. When we shift aggregate supply curve outwards, we are able to increase national output, which is a positive thing. National output goes up. National income increases as well, because these are the same thing, as we've learned in the lecture on circular flow. National income is higher, which allows us to consume more, increase the standards of living. Moreover, it leads to higher employment level, because we need more staff in order to produce this higher level of output. Our economy is growing, we create additional jobs, and employment level goes up, which of course leads to a reduction in unemployment level. There are so many vacancies available that everyone who wants to work is now able to get a job, right? And apart from this, our price level drops, price level declines, current price level, and the rate of inflation slows down. Inflation rate is now lower. So generally, we do not, supply-side policies does not have the downsides of contraction rate and expansion demand-side policies. Recall, demand-side policies are fiscal and monetary policies which will shift aggregate demand curve up or down. Supply-side policies are policies aimed to increase production potential of the economy. Supply-side policies do not involve monetary or fiscal measures. Instead, we are trying to stimulate other things. We are trying to increase productivity, encourage investment in capital stock, accumulate human capital, provide education, training, and so on. There are two main approaches to the supply-side policies. As I mentioned previously, there are different schools of macroeconomic thought, and they have different opinions on how it should be implemented. For example, New Classical and New Austrian schools favor market-oriented policies, which mainly focus on freeing up markets, removing market imperfections, reducing monopoly power, trade union power, and so on, and improving market incentives. For example, deregulation, reducing red tape, making it easier to set up new businesses, privatization, providing tax incentives for this, and so on. These measures, according to New Classical schools of economic thought, should lead to an increase in potential output. On the other hand, Keynesian school advocates direct interventionist policies. In other words, they focus on direct government provision of transport infrastructure, training, funds for research and development, and so on. So Keynesian school advocates the bigger government in the society. They suggest that taxes should be high in order to stimulate higher government expenditure. They suggest increasing taxes and government expenditure at the same time, because they believe that government will know better how to spend money and where to direct them. What you also need to know is that supply-side policies can frequently have demand-side effects, and the other way around. For example, tax incentives aimed to encourage higher rate of technological progress will affect both demand and supply side of the market, because taxes is a fiscal measure. They can change the location of aggregate demand curve, but by stimulating potential output, they can shift aggregate supply curve as well. Or government spending on infrastructure or on education, etc., again, will shift aggregate demand curve, because government expenditure is a direct component of aggregate demand, but it will also hopefully increase production potential of the economy and increase the rate of economic growth and shift aggregate supply. That is why government policymakers will need to take this secondary effect into account when making economic policy decisions. This is the last slide we've had to cover. And there is quite a lot of reading which I suggest for this particular topic. There is some compulsory reading, just a few pages in Sloman, chapter 20. However, I do recommend to read a little bit more on how fiscal and monetary policy is used in practice, because it will help you in your future personal and professional life. If you know what actions the government or central bank are likely to take, you might be able to adjust your personal financial strategy accordingly. For example, if you know that Bank of England is likely to increase interest rates, you might be able to remortgage your property, your house, before interest rates go up and save a few £1,000s. Or if you know that taxes are likely to increase in the future, again, you can adjust your personal financial strategy. This can benefit your future professional life too. So I strongly recommend that you read these additional chapters. They are more advanced, however, they will benefit you for the rest of your life. That's all I wanted to cover today. Thank you very much for joining me. Bye-bye.